As we begin our exploration of the world's greatest paintings, we will look at only two works by two great artists, Duccio and Giotto. But they are compound works. The first, a very large altarpiece comprising multiple images, and the second, a chapel. The first work in our procession of masterpieces originally consisted of some 70 paintings on panels united on a single structure, front and back. It is the Majesty by Duccio di Buoninsegna of Siena. The Sienese painter, always simply called Duccio, was born about 1255 and died about 1318. Documented as a decorative painter by 1278, he had already achieved a great reputation by the time he was 30 with his large Madonna and angels called the Rucellai Madonna. So he was over 50 when commissioned by the officials of the Siena Cathedral in 1308 to paint a large, complex painting for the high altar of the cathedral, the Majesty. Majesty means majesty and refers to the majesty of the Virgin enthroned with the Christ child. Although it is the ensemble that properly constitutes the work, my approach will be to look first at the altar, particularly the front, and then at just two of its constituent parts as representative of the whole altar's greatness. It was painted for the high altar of the cathedral and is today in the Cathedral Museum. The medium is tempera, and the support is wood. Many panels of wood fitted together, the grain matched to avoid warping. Tempera is a water-based medium in which dry pigments are suspended in egg yolk. The effect of its natural glossiness was enhanced by the underlying white gesso applied on the wood painting surface. Therefore, it was characterized by brilliance of color, and it was also very durable. It was the dominant painting medium for individual paintings before oil paints became popular. If you have never seen this painting, which is likely, or a reproduction of it, or if you have no knowledge of why it was painted or even what the broad subject is, you can still feel its greatness when you first encounter it. Since our first experience of art is usually through reproductions, it's essential to pay attention to the real size of the original painting. In this case, the Majesty is about 7 feet high and 14 feet wide. In meters, about 2.1 by 4.3. Very large indeed, but not as large as it was originally, which I will explain later. The initial strong impact of this painting is due to its size, its design, and color. The seated Virgin Mary holding the Christ child is about life-size, and she seems still larger, since the figures on either side are intentionally made smaller to magnify her size and her importance. She is visually powerful. She is awesome. It is not only her physical size that produces such an impact, it's also the strong design. The broad, simple, measured shape of her deep blue robe, with its slow upward curve on the left side, pausing for a moment at the overlapping golden cloth that drapes her marble throne. That side contrasts with the more complex and energetic right side. The Christ child is as solemn in his expression as his mother, but the lively curves in his star-embroidered robe are echoed in the expressive curves of Mary's robe below him. We are soon aware of the stylized simplicity of Mary's ovoid head, with its almond-shaped eyes, aquiline nose, and small mouth. I should note that the greenish tone, which you may observe, is an undercolor that has reappeared as the pale flesh tones thinned. Duccio has reserved this stylized treatment for the largest and most public part of his painting, as if he decided that it would reinforce the degree of hieratic solemnity he desired here. The quiet sadness that is found in Mary's eyes is also an expressive trait of his. The many saints and angels who flank the central group are presented as an organized assembly, and the unity is emphasized by the congruent flow of the robes. The large kneeling figures are clothed in vivid red or gold robes, and all the figures are linked by the golden discs of their halos, which nearly merge with the golden ground. This gold ground is the principal source of the brilliance of the painting. It's related to the glow of the mosaics of Byzantine art, which on the Italian peninsula were seen principally in Ravenna and Venice. The golden tesserae, individual pieces in mosaics, were made of gold leaf fused between two pieces of clear glass. In panel paintings like Duccio's, these tesserae were replaced by gold leaf applied to the gessoed surface of the wood. These gold ground paintings, as brilliant as they may seem today, have dimmed through age and abrasion, and we need to imagine the Majesty in its original intensity when the gold was fresh and the reflections from it seemed like light emanating from the painting. Stunning today. It must have seemed miraculous then. The Siena Cathedral is very large, and the altarpiece had to have tremendous carrying power, like that of music, the resonant sound of a brass choir or an organ. The pictorial equivalents of such music are physical size, clarity of composition, and brilliant color. To Duccio's contemporaries, and for centuries after, the saints were easily identifiable, since their physical and symbolic attributes were already well established in art, from hairstyles to swords and books. I will take a moment to identify several of these for you. On the right side of the Madonna, our right, I can point out St. Peter in green with short white hair. He is the second figure from the right, the first male. Next to him, in dark beard, black beard and hair, is John the Baptist, and to the right of St. Peter is St. Agnes. Her symbol is her lamb, and here the lamb is an engraved lamb on a kind of disc that she holds in her hands. On the other side, on the left of the Madonna, I'll just point out St. Paul. He's in the same rank, that is to say the middle rank, and he's the second figure from the left-hand side next to the female saint, again in a dark beard, and he holds a sword on his shoulder, which is his symbol. The four kneeling saints in front, very prominent, are unfamiliar to us, but not to the townspeople, for they're the patron saints of Siena. Innumerable Catholic churches are dedicated to Mary, who indeed was synonymous with the church personified. And the great Cathedral of Siena was dedicated to the Assumption of the Virgin into heaven, a subject we'll talk about again. So it was to be expected that the principal altarpiece would feature her. The altarpiece was also covered with narrative paintings on the reverse side, and this is how that appears today. The verso, as it is so called, same term for the other side of a page of a book. This, the back side of the altar, was rarely seen by the general public, since it faced an area occupied by clergy and monks. So in these smaller panels, the narrative scenes were still legible to those individuals who were relatively close to the altar. These panels, and there are many, are masterpieces of narrative painting, retelling Christ's life and ministry. I will show you two, and as on the front of the altar, Duccio paints on a gold ground throughout. In the large crucifixion, this gold ground visually pushes the crucified figures, especially the brightly lit body of Jesus, insistently toward us. Duccio organized the other figures into simple and memorable groups, flanking the cross of Christ. They seem pushed back, to the right and to the left, by the force of the crucifixion. Both groups, his mother and followers on our left, and the mob that sought his death on the right are tightly packed, but they're quite different. The followers, with the fainting Mary in front, are erect and composed, but the mob is appropriately conflicted, with standing and seated figures, small groups of peering or whispering heads, and contrary gestures. While some of his tormentors still mock him, others now seem dubious or fearful. The jagged fissures in the rocky hill of Calvary are prompted by words in the Gospel of Matthew following Jesus' death. The earth did quake and the rocks rent. From among the smaller narrative panels, I've chosen one which has an astonishing formal compression, like that of a great short story. The Pact of Judas. A simple, if ugly, story of a man taking money to set up the arrest of a friend. And Duccio tells it simply, directly, therefore perfectly. Judas is meeting with the chief priests and elders who desire the arrest of Jesus, and he steps forward eagerly to accept the purse with 30 pieces of silver, the price of his betrayal. I said eagerly because the 9 Jewish leaders stand stock still with only 2 hand gestures among them, while Judas strides to the center, head thrust forward, hands outstretched for the purse. There are a dozen small touches of compositional genius in this panel, but there's one brilliant stroke in which composition and story fully join. Inside the open loggia, one sees the rose-colored ribs of the black groin vaults, and 5 of them, 5 of the ribs converge at Judas' head, like 5 fingers of accusation. Superb. Here is a reconstruction of the original Majesty, the front of the altarpiece of the Majesty, which gives you an idea of how much has been lost, all of those pinnacles. Duccio is credited with inventing this kind of super altarpiece, monumental in size and architecturally conceived with a base, a middle, and a top. Well, what happened to it? In brief, the Majesty remained in its honored place for nearly 2 centuries, until changing taste dictated its replacement. It was moved to a secondary chapel, where in order to accommodate it, the gables with their paintings and other ornaments were removed. In 1771, it was sawed in half between the front and the back, so that its 2 faces could be displayed separately. When this early pre-Renaissance period of Italian art fell into disregard in the 19th century, the predella, the base, was removed, and some panels from its front and back were sold, ending up in museums from London to Washington to New York. Some scenes and individual angels from the upper portion of the altarpiece were also dispersed. The Majesty was the most prestigious commission of Duccio's career, and it took him and his assistants more than 2½ years to complete it, working on nothing else during that period, as stipulated by the contract. It is always interesting to know what contemporary critics thought about a work. There were no professional art critics yet, but there was a public whose response was duly recorded. On June 9th, 1311, the huge altarpiece was carried in procession from Duccio's studio outside the gates. The religious community, the civic leaders, and, quote, all the people accompanied the painting up to the cathedral while all the bells rang joyfully. In this way, the altarpiece was taken into the cathedral and placed upon the main altar. End of quote. The people had spoken. Our second composite work is a chapel. Not just any chapel, mind you, but the Arena Chapel, the masterpiece of Giotto. Giotto di Bondone was born in Tuscany around 1266, so about 10 years after Duccio. He was a Florentine painter and architect, and he painted important frescoes at the shrine of St. Francis in Assisi, but his undying reputation was made in Padua, near Venice. The Arena Chapel's interior contains one of the most famous painted ensembles in the history of European art. Called the Cappella Scrovegni, for it's the man who commissioned it, it is universally known as the Arena Chapel because it stands on the site of a Roman amphitheater. It was painted by Giotto from about 1303 to 1305, some think as late as 1310, but perhaps more likely in a shorter period. Its many individual painted scenes are on the walls of the once private chapel, and are, of course, much larger than the narrative panels on Duccio's altarpiece, much larger. I will show you views of the chapel and 2 of the 38 large narrative scenes. This cycle of stories of the life of the Virgin Mary and of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus is painted in fresco. The technique in which pigments are dispersed in water and painted into wet plaster is the preeminent mural painting technique in Western art. The word fresco means fresh, and it demands fairly rapid application of the colors while the wet plaster can still absorb them. Giotto was a painter from Tuscany, but was already so well known for his work at the shrine of St. Francis at Assisi that a patron from northern Italy, Enrico Scrovegni, sought him out. The chapel measures about 69 feet long by 26 feet wide by 43 feet high. In meters again, about 21 by 8 by 13 meters. And it is lit by tall lancet windows on the south wall to your right in this image, the only light in the chapel. Let me now show you a section of the south wall, showing an image we'll be looking at in a moment in detail, and I'll describe the position on the wall. We're looking at the south wall, and we're looking at the upper right-hand corner on the south wall where the meeting at the Golden Gate is seen. It's very near the front wall of the chapel. The scene, though part of the series devoted to the Virgin Mary, actually relates the events in the lives of her parents, Joachim and Anna. They were childless and elderly, and when they received separate angelic messengers who informed them of Anna's pregnancy, she rushed from their home and he from the fields where he tended his flock, and they met at the Golden Gate to the city. The reunited couple, joyful in their knowledge, embrace at the gate. Giotto represents this event and stresses its significance in 2 ways. First, the embrace itself, in which the 2 become one. They are large, impressive figures. Compare their expansive forms with the other figures in the scene. And when combined, they form a curving, arch-like unit culminating in their overlapping heads and halos. They're motionless in their embrace, and the significance of the moment and the fullness of their devotion are supported by the architecture, the pier-like tower of the gate and its arch which points directly to them, while enclosing most of the remaining actors who are coming from the city. You will remember Duccio's very similar use of architecture in the Pact of Judas. Their embrace is one of love and fulfillment, and is, I think, deeply affecting. But there is a disturbing note at this moment of personal fulfillment. The black-clad woman beside them, to the right. While all the other women move toward Joachim and Anna, this woman, her face half covered, looks away, and her black robe contrasts with and divides the figures. She's literally an ominous figure, but why should there be a dark omen at such a joyous moment? This is much discussed, but remember that the unexpected conception and birth of Mary foreshadows her own miraculous conception and the birth of Jesus, which leads to grief when Jesus is crucified. This dark lady, one generation removed from that event, may be an omen of that loss, a loss which Giotto also commemorated in the chapel in the painting of the Lamentation. I show you a section of the wall, and I will point out where the Lamentation is. We're looking at 6 of the frescoes in 3 tiers. The lowest one on the left-hand tier, to the left of the middle dividing arch, really, of the entire chapel, the one to the left, is the Lamentation. Of all the subjects drawn from the Christian Bible, surely none has a more immediate claim on our experience of loss, or so powerfully arouses our pity, our compassion. The deposition from the cross and the entombment are related in the Gospels, but the Lamentation is only implied. Yet in religious art, it developed into a major theme, often involving many persons who were present at the crucifixion and others of the artist's invention. Perhaps because we could relate to it in a direct, emotional way. In Giotto's painting, 18 human figures may be present. It does not seem crowded, because half the figures are grouped in that single unit at the far left, while the principal figures are organized in skillfully measured subgroups. Standing quietly at the right are Nicodemus, farthest to the right, who assisted in the deposition of Christ from the cross, and Joseph of Arimathea next to him, who offered his own prepared tomb for Christ. The seated woman in a red robe is Mary Magdalene, who supports the feet of Christ. 3 figures bend to the left with increasing urgency. An anonymous seated woman in green who leans toward Jesus and Mary, a woman who kneels and stretches out her hands to hold those of the dead body, and a young man in a rose-colored robe, John the Evangelist, who bows from the waist and throws both arms back in the most extroverted gesture in the painting. Then there is a pause, a space, intensified by the emotion pulsing through it to the soul-stirring core of the mother and son. But that crux of loss is also reached by a rocky scarp, a diagonal of grief that descends from a small dead tree, reinforces the head and outflung arms of John, and arrives at the place where the Virgin cradles her son in her lap, supported by her knee. Their 2 heads and their 2 halos, placed in intense juxtaposition, a concentration of tenderness and sorrow. This climactic moment is also marked by a tight cluster of standing mourners. I should point out that the woman in the pale robe supports his head with her hands in the corner at the left, a detail that is easily missed. The 2 massive, draped women are a great invention of Giotto's. They seem to guard the body, and their anonymous, ungesturing forms are a foil to the overt grief of others, stoically drawing grief to themselves until they also seem to swell with the excess. All of this astonishing tableau may be called composed grief, both in its supreme arrangement of figures and in its expression of sorrow, which is most intense in John and most controlled in the Virgin Mary's face. The diagonal rock both unifies the figures and directs all eyes to the epicenter of loss. But the rock is also an emotional divide in the painting, separating the relative control of those below from the angelic lamentation in the sky above. 10 small angels, some painted in dramatic foreshortening, react to the tragedy with unbridled, spasmodic grief. They are an explosive counterpoint to the measured chords of the human figures and the descending melodic lament of the rocky slope. Their grief is unbounded, and they permit the release of our own emotions. You see that Giotto had a profound understanding of the human condition, and he expressed it with a new, powerful, artistic style. He is the first of the great monumental figure painters in modern European art, and his influence was incalculable. More importantly, the impress of his heart through this style leaves an indelible mark in our hearts, reviving memories of our own losses, while expanding our capacity to feelingly comprehend the sorrows of others. We can ask no more of any art. I would hope that when you are traveling in Italy, if and when, and are anywhere near either of the sites of these two great works of art, the Majesty in Siena and the Arena Chapel in Padua, that you will go out of your way, far out of your way if necessary, to visit them. They will repay you greatly. And it should be noted that while you can go to Siena and go to the Opera del Duomo, the museum that houses the Majesty, you will see it with little trouble, relatively speaking. If you are going to Padua, you're going to, these days, have to make a reservation. There is no other way around it. These great works of art, many of them recently preserved and well publicized during the conservation. The Arena Chapel, for instance, was closed for years while they did a painstaking restoration of all the frescoes, and an extraordinary one. And as in the case of other similar restorations and great sites of art, especially in Italy, they have now limited the number of people who can get in very greatly, and you're sort of sent through a purification chamber before you get in, and you go in small groups for a short amount of time. Some of these sites cost more than others. The Arena Chapel's not expensive, but you ought to remember to reserve some time, months perhaps, in advance, and study their schedule well, because you might be able to get a back-to-back viewing. It is possible. Pay twice, but get more than twice the time to see the works in the Arena Chapel. When I last saw this work before, I'm thinking of the Lamentation specifically, before the restoration, it immediately followed, this will date me a bit, upon the assassination of Aldo Moro, the Prime Minister. And it was even more moving than usual to stand in front of this great Italian work, which represents the Italian people and their culture, and realize what they had been enduring for many, many, many months. The Lamentation by Giotto is one of the most powerful and one of the most universal works of art, which treats grief in a way that each of us can feel and understand, even while it is a central piece in this great religious cycle of the Arena Chapel. I want to thank you for your kind attention.